I never told my son about my monthly $40,000 salary. Even now, saying it aloud feels strange, like I am speaking about someone else's life. Because the truth is, money was never the center of mine. Silence was. My name is Margaret. I am an old woman now, with slow steps and steady hands. But I was not always like this. There was a time when my world was loud with struggle, when every coin mattered, when I counted groceries twice before buying them, when I stayed awake at night calculating how to stretch 1 week into 2. Daniel was just a boy then. He never saw the nights I cried quietly after he slept. He never knew how many times I chose his comfort over my own hunger. I made sure of that. A child should grow in warmth, not in worry. Years passed. Slowly, carefully, I built a life. Not suddenly, not magically, but patiently. I learned new skills, took opportunities others ignored, invested wisely, trusted very few people, but trusted myself enough. And one day, without celebration or announcement, I realized I had more than enough to live well, more than enough to rest. But by then, simplicity had already become part of me. I didn't want luxury. I didn't need to prove anything. I had spent too many years learning that peace is not found in expensive things. It is found in quiet control over your life. So I kept everything the same. I still wore simple clothes, cooked my own meals, used the same old furniture I had grown attached to, not because I couldn't afford better, but because I no longer measured life that way. Daniel grew up watching that version of me. To him, I was just modest, careful, ordinary. He never asked questions, and I never offered answers. Not out of secrecy, but out of intention. I wanted him to build his own life without leaning on mine. I wanted him to value people for who they were, not for what they had. I believed, perhaps too deeply, that the values I lived would be the values he absorbed. But children do not always see what we mean for them to see. They see what is visible, and sometimes they misunderstand silence. As Daniel grew older, I noticed small changes, nothing dramatic, just quiet shifts. The way he spoke about success, the way he admired people with wealth, the way he distanced himself from anything that looked less. I told myself it was natural. The world teaches these things loudly, louder than a quiet mother ever could. Still, I trusted him. I trusted that beneath it all, he remembered where he came from. I trusted that he understood the difference between value and price. So I continued living the way I always had, softly, simply, without explanation, because I believed something very deeply. If someone truly loves you, they will never need proof of your worth, and if they do, no amount of explanation will ever be enough. I just didn't realize at the time how close I was to learning that lesson again, not from the world, but from my own son. The evening of the dinner arrived quietly, but my heart felt unusually heavy. I stood in front of my wardrobe for a long time, not because I didn't know what to wear, but because I knew exactly what I was choosing. A soft, faded cardigan, a simple skirt, shoes that had seen many years but still carried me gently. I looked at myself in the mirror and smiled, not with sadness, but with awareness. "This is not disguise," I whispered softly. "This is a test, not of them, but of truth." When Daniel opened the door, the warmth I expected did not arrive. Instead, there was a brief pause, just long enough for me to notice, just short enough for him to hide. "Mom," he said, stepping aside quickly. "Come in." The house was beautiful, not loud or excessive, but carefully curated. Every object seemed chosen to reflect taste, stability, and quiet pride. Clara greeted me with a polite embrace. "It's so nice to finally meet you," she said. Her words were kind, but her eyes were cautious, studying, measuring, deciding. And then I met her parents. Her father shook my hand firmly, his smile controlled. Her mother gave me a softer greeting, but her gaze lingered a moment too long on my clothes, my shoes, my posture. Not cruel, but not kind either. It was the kind of look that quietly places you somewhere lower. We sat down for dinner, and for a while, everything felt normal. Plates were passed, Small talk floated across the table, but slowly, gently, the conversation began to change. "So, Margaret," her father said, folding his hands, "what kind of work do you do?" The table grew just a little quieter. I lowered my eyes slightly, letting my voice soften. "Oh, nothing very big. I've always managed small jobs here and there." I felt Daniel shift in his seat, not in support, but in discomfort. "I see," her mother replied, nodding slowly. "That must have been challenging, raising a child like that." Like that. The words were light, almost sympathetic, but they carried something underneath, something unspoken. I smiled gently. It taught me patience. Clara quickly changed the subject, speaking about Daniel's career, his achievements, his future plans, and as she spoke, I listened carefully, not to her words, but to what was missing. My name never appeared in his story. My sacrifices were not part of his success. It was as if he had simply arrived. At one point, her father chuckled lightly. "Well, Daniel has certainly done well for himself, built a life quite different from where he started." Different. The word lingered in the air. I turned my eyes toward Daniel, waiting, not for praise, not for recognition, but for truth. Just one sentence, something simple. "My mother worked hard for everything I have." But he only smiled politely and nodded. That small moment, so quiet, so ordinary, carried a weight deeper than any insult, because silence, when it should speak, becomes its own kind of betrayal. As the evening continued, I noticed more. The way Clara gently avoided including me in deeper conversations. The way her mother spoke about standards and backgrounds in careful, indirect language. The way Daniel remained comfortable in that space, as long as I stayed small. And I did stay small, not out of weakness, but out of clarity. Because sometimes the strongest thing you can do is not defend yourself, but observe. By the time dinner ended, I felt no anger, no sharp pain, just a quiet understanding settling inside me. They had measured my worth that night, and my son had allowed the measurement. I thanked them sincerely before leaving, not because I was pleased, but because they had given me something valuable, not respect, but truth. And truth, even when it hurts, is always worth more than comfort built on illusion. There is a kind of silence that feels peaceful, and then there is the kind that slowly opens your eyes. That night, I discovered the second. After the conversation softened and the plates were cleared, something in the room changed. The politeness remained, but the effort behind it grew thinner. People reveal themselves not in what they say, but in how long they can pretend. I sat quietly, my hands folded in my lap, listening more than speaking. Clara's mother began talking about family values. She spoke gently but with precision, as if every word had been chosen to sound kind, while carrying a quiet message beneath it. "You know," she said, glancing at Clara, "it's important for families to come from similar backgrounds. It makes everything easier." Easier. Her eyes shifted toward me just for a second. I smiled faintly, as if I hadn't noticed, but I had. Her father added, "Of course, what matters most is where you're going in life." Again, his tone was smooth, reasonable, acceptable. But the meaning was clear. Some people begin lower. Some people must be elevated. And in that moment, I wasn't offended. I was simply aware. I turned my gaze toward Daniel again, not urgently, not pleadingly, but with quiet hope. This was his moment, not to defend me loudly, not to argue, just to acknowledge me, to gently place truth back into the room. But he remained still, comfortable, silent. That was when something inside me shifted, not like breaking glass, not like sudden pain, but like a door closing slowly, with full understanding. Because I realized something very important. My son wasn't confused. He wasn't unaware. He had made a choice, a quiet one, a careful one. He had chosen to let them believe I was less, because correcting them might make him uncomfortable. And discomfort, to him, had become something to avoid. I lowered my eyes, not in shame, but in reflection. I thought about all the years I had spent protecting him from discomfort, from hunger, from worry, from fear. And now, here he was, protecting himself from something much smaller: truth. Clara spoke again, filling the space. Daniel has always been very independent, she said proudly. He built everything on his own. The words settled gently on the table. No one questioned them, and Daniel accepted them. That was the moment I stopped waiting, because sometimes silence is not empty. It answers you. It tells you everything you need to know, if you are willing to listen without emotion clouding it. I didn't feel anger. That surprised me. I didn't feel the urge to correct them, to reveal myself, to change the direction of the evening, because what would that have done? Forced respect is not real respect, and truth, when spoken to the unwilling, becomes noise. So I chose something different. I chose to stay quiet, but not the quiet of weakness, the quiet of understanding, the quiet of someone who has seen enough to stop expecting more. As the evening came to an end, Clara's mother smiled politely and said, "It was nice meeting you." Nice. A word that means everything and nothing. I nodded warmly. Thank you for having me. And I meant it, because they had given me something rare, not kindness, not acceptance, but clarity. And clarity has a way of changing you, gently, permanently. As I stepped out of that house and into the cool night air, I took a slow breath. My heart was not heavy. It was steady, because I finally understood something I had missed for years. Love, when mixed with silence, can sometimes hide the truth. But silence, when observed carefully, will always reveal it. A week passed after that dinner. 7 quiet days. I did not call Daniel, and he did not call me. Not out of anger, at least not from my side, but out of space. The kind of space that allows truth to settle where emotions once lived. During those days, I returned to my routines. I watered my plants in the morning, read by the window in the afternoon, and sat in stillness during the evenings. My life had always been peaceful, but now it felt clearer, not emptier, just clearer. By the end of the week, I made a decision, not to confront, not to accuse, but to invite. "Come visit me," I told him gently over the phone. There was a pause on the other end. "Your place?" he asked, almost uncertain. "Yes," I replied softly. "My place." He had never been there before. I had always visited him, never the other way around. It wasn't intentional. It had simply become that way. When he arrived, I opened the door myself, and for the first time in years, I saw my son, without certainty. He stood still at the entrance. His eyes moved slowly, taking in the space, the light, the quiet elegance that I had never shown him, the soft rugs beneath his feet, the shelves filled with books and memories, the calm, unspoken order of a life well lived. "Mom," he whispered, almost as if the word had changed meaning. "This is yours?" I smiled, not proudly, but peacefully. "Yes." He stepped inside, still looking around, trying to understand a truth that had existed all along, just hidden. "I don't understand," he said finally. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" I gestured toward the chair across from me. "Sit." We sat together, just as we had when he was a boy. I poured tea into 2 simple cups, the same kind I had always used, because some things I never needed to change. "I didn't tell you," I said gently, "because I wanted you to build your life without depending on mine." He looked down, his hands tightening slightly. "I thought." He hesitated. "I thought you were struggling." "I know," I replied calmly. There was no accusation in my voice. That made it harder for him. "And what did that make me to you?" I asked quietly. He didn't answer, but his silence this time was different. It wasn't protective. It wasn't comfortable. It was honest. "I was embarrassed," he finally admitted, his voice low. "Not of you, but of what I thought you were." The words hung between us, and strangely, they didn't hurt, because I had already heard them, just in a different form, across a dinner table, wrapped in silence. "I understand," I said softly. He looked up, surprised. "You do?" "Yes," I nodded. "The world teaches us to measure everything: people, success, even love." I paused, then added gently, "But we choose whether we believe it." His eyes filled, but I did not move to comfort him. Not because I didn't care, but because this moment wasn't about easing pain. It was about allowing truth to exist. "I'm sorry, Mom," he said, his voice unsteady. "I should have said something that night." "Yes," I replied simply. No anger, no softness to erase the truth, just acknowledgement. We sat in silence for a while after that, but this silence was different. It was no longer revealing, it was settling. "I forgive you," I said after a moment, "not because it was small, but because I don't want to carry it." He nodded slowly. But forgiveness does not always mean things return to what they were, and I think deep down he understood that. From that day on, I loved my son just the same, but I changed something quietly. I stopped making myself smaller to fit into his comfort. I stopped filling spaces where I was not fully seen. I stopped offering parts of myself that were not respected, not out of pride, but out of peace. I visited less often, spoke more honestly, and allowed distance where closeness once existed without understanding. And in that distance, something gentle happened. Not separation, but balance. Daniel began to reach out more, not out of obligation, but out of awareness. And I responded when it felt right. That is the grace of letting go. Not pushing someone away, not holding them tightly, but standing still within yourself and allowing others to meet you there, if they choose. Because in the end, self-respect is quiet. It doesn't demand. It doesn't fight. It simply remains.